My screen shared here. Um, all right. Are you seeing that presentation screen there?
Yep, looks good.
Cool. So yeah, I added a little bit more of a, a title, basically the same thing as what you said, though, talking about sustainable tourism and what it is, and a little bit how it is practiced in the Keweenaw. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you so much for the invitation. I just want to say it's not a common kind of chance that academics get to just kind of talk about a general topic like this. Normally, we're getting very, very detailed in some minutia of something. So it's fun to kind of step way back and think about, okay, I teach two sustainable tourism courses at Tech, an intro course, and then a more kind of senior level course. How can I distill, 2 semesters worth of classes down into half an hour or so of conversation? And so I'm attempting to do that here. Um, Thank you for the introduction. Whoa, went further than I wanted. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Um, I am an assistant professor of geography in the Department of Social Sciences. And while I do research sustainable tourism and sustainable communities, my primary research is on institutions of and landscapes of memory and heritage, thinking about national parks, national museums, other museums, monuments, memorials, things like that, often are tourist sites. And so I naturally have this intersection with tourism studies and tourism geographies, which is a subfield of the discipline of geography as well. Um, when I was asked to kind of do this presentation, I made it very clear that my research isn't in the Keweenaw. Most of my research takes place in Europe, actually. You can see kind of the lower left here is Las Medulas in kind of northwestern Spain, which is a hydraulic gold mining region that the Romans went through. And
Hmm.
then the big picture there is an old slate quarry in northern Wales. Both of these are now World Heritage sites, and sort of the type of research that I do on kind of post-extractive landscapes and how people continue to visit them and how people's stories are told within these spaces, but also thinking about how to practice sustainable tourism as you're telling those stories. But rest assured, I do have a whole section at the end talking about the Keweenaw, because you can't really live here and not think about those intersections. But thinking big picture, before we get into sustainable tourism, I just want to kind of reiterate thinking about sustainability. Um, Very often we think about sustainability and the environment or ecological sustainability. I just want to kind of reiterate that that's not the full picture. When we're thinking about a sustainable plan or sustainable solutions or a sustainable world, we are thinking about an interconnected system from economic sustainability, political sustainability, cultural sustainability, and environmental sustainability. And all of these things fuel each other. And honestly, uh, an an unsustainable political structure or economy or kind of culture or environment can disrupt and kind of create a cascade across these other pillars. And perhaps you're more familiar thinking about the pillars of sustainability, economic, social, and environmental. I like to separate out the social into the kind of political institutions that we have and the cultural as more along the lines of kind of cultural practice and how we maintain cultural practices that are so valued in our communities as well. But these things, the same idea, these are pillars that create a sustainable system, and you take any single one of those away, and the system collapses. So, sustainable tourism is no different. Sustainable economic solutions within tourism are fueled by and in response to sustainable political decisions and sustainable environmental kind of actions, all within thinking about sustainable culture and sustainable cultural practice. These things are all interconnected, and hopefully you'll see that kind of as we go through here. And and again, this is coming from my kind of teacher side, thinking about all of this is connected into policy and planning. Everything that we do thinking about sustainable tourism, if we think about sustainability as this long-term, uh, indefinite, sustainable solution to environmental, economic, political, cultural problems, again, all through the lens of a tourism industry, those solutions are only possible by enacting policy and planning for that long-term solution or that long-term um, mitigation or long-term goals that you may have. So policy and its kind of subsection of planning fuels sustainable tourism, and sustainable tourism thus will then impact how future policy and planning undergoes. And so when I teach, we teach through a lens of policy and planning in the Department of Social Sciences around tourism. So, and just kind of give a little bit more specifics into, okay, what do I mean by policy? What do I mean by planning? So policy is basically the governance that oversees tourism. Stems from this is ideal policy and ideal planning stems from research that tells us what are the impacts of tourism on the economy, on the environment, what's our capacity as a community to host individuals, what's our capacity as a community to maintain our environment, maintain our infrastructure. All of these conditions through kind of intensive research informs what our plan could be and what our goal would be with tourism. And thinking about whatever that goal may be in a planning ideal planning situation, we think about what are our objectives, and if we're thinking about sustainable tourism objectives, how can those objectives be maintained over the course of multiple generations? What are the strategies to achieve those objectives, and what are the specific tactics? What are the kind of on the ground decisions and actions that we're taking to fulfill those strategies, to achieve those objectives, to hit that overarching goal. And so that's kind of the world that I work in as I'm thinking through where these things lie. And I'll kind of avoid complicated charts going forward, hopefully. Um, okay, starting with economic sustainability. And this is kind of how I'm going to structure this talk, going through these different pillars, different sections. Thinking about economic sustainability as the ability of an economy to support a defined level of economic production indefinitely. Is it possible? Maybe. Um, but it's a goal, right? Um, and one of the biggest hurdles to overcome when we're thinking about economic sustainability is the idea of perpetual economic growth. Um, Economic growth, hopefully, this is not a surprise, but you cannot grow indefinitely, particularly when you're talking about a finite number of resources or a finite space. So how can you plan around this infinite growth model that too many of our communities kind of lock onto and instead plan around the inevitable economic decline, the inevitable population decline that will come from the natural cycles that all of our communities go through. And I don't know if this quote is even real and or who this person is, but I just love this meme because the kind of facial expression connected to the quote, I really think speaks to this notion of moving away from this idea of exponential growth as being even remotely sustainable, and instead thinking about other solutions that we may have in economic kind of sectors, the tourism sector being a major economic industry. So, what are some of these solutions? Perhaps you're aware of the slow movement, and you've heard of maybe slow food
Yeah.
before.
Food.
Yeah. So this is a broader kind of economic term that it doesn't just apply to slow food, it applies to many aspects of the economy. And slow tourism has also been adopted. Again, just kind of reiterating in economics, broadly speaking, the slow movement refers to methods used to retain the use and value of a material or product for as long as possible. So making sure that things can be repaired, making sure that quality over quantity, making sure that the parts perhaps are fixable or adjustable or interconnected, um, things like that, connected into this slow movement. In slow tourism, perhaps it's not too hard to kind of make that next uh, jump, thinking about highlighting experience over consumption. Also thinking about, again, quality over quantity, thinking about community engagement and education rather than kind of whirlwind experiences. And overall, it's this concentration of time, money, and travel. And in the United States, it's very hard to be able to practice slow tourism unless, many of us don't have long stretches of time or money to be able to travel with this kind of experience, long-term slow tourism experience. Um, Really, unless you're a student or a teacher, you don't have long periods of time in which you have kind of free time, and if you're in either of those categories, you don't have the money to do kind of intensive travel. But if we look outside the United States, and before the talk was going on, we were talking about some of the Scandinavian countries, for example, where you have perhaps 30 days of paid vacation um, mandated by the government for any job. You have the possibility of not just kind of hopping around to see, let's say you're going to travel to Latin America rather than trying to hit as many countries as possible and see the most important of the sites, the waterfalls, the capitals, the concert halls, um, whatever it may be. Instead, you're going to go to one place. You're going to spend 2, 3 weeks in that place, a long enough time where you can actually learn about the community and some of the values of the community and maybe even engage in that community. I like kind of giving an example of you show up, um, spending a couple days there, you see an art gallery opening, and you go to the opening for the art gallery. And at the art gallery, now you're in the community where probably a lot of other people from that community are showing their art, just like, if you think about our art gallery in Hancock, right? You might see a flyer for a forest cleanup or some other kind of community activity, and that kind of snowballs into, again, this kind of concentration of your time where it's no longer kind of extracting as much as you possibly can in short bursts around different places, but instead you might actually be able to give back a little bit while also getting a meaningful experience and learning quite a bit about that community in that process. There's also the economic impacts of spending more concentration of time in a place. You're no longer perhaps just staying at the biggest hotel and going to the fanciest restaurant, oftentimes probably owned by some multinational corporation. Now you're spending 3 weeks. You can go to those, more mom and pop shops, those locally owned places, perhaps spend different times in different places and kind of experience, again, more of this kind of local sense of the tourist experience in a place. There's also this concept that's been growing within tourism of degrowth. And again, this is a broader economic term as well. And this is basically planning, again, against this perpetual growth model. And instead thinking about first scaling down consumption, but also right sizing instead of downsizing, right? You're not necessarily stopping consumption, but you're shifting the focus to human need. You're thinking about, again, how can you um, plan for cycles, economic cycles, political cycles, cultural cycles, um, environmental cycles, but how can you also make sure that as you're planning, your impacts are well, they're not focused again on that consumption. Their impacts are focused more on um, addressing, in tourism, the carrying capacity. How many people can actually be housed in a place? How many people can actually use a road at the same time? How many people could a community feel comfortable having kind of hiking on a trail? At what point does it become, no longer pleasurable to go on a hike if you have too many people, in the forest with you? Um, and also thinking about the social justice aspect of this kind of shift from consumption to some more community control. Just as I was talking about before, this kind of community control rather than multinational control. If you're no longer focusing on kind of rapid and ever increasing consumption, where often multinational corporations have to come in because they have the kind of money to be able to build those massive hotels, to build massive restaurant chains, and to staff them in a way that kind of our local industry might not be able to keep up with that. But it also enables us to think about possibly human rights, but at least kind of the cultural contexts in the places that we're visiting, rather than again just kind of consuming as much as we can as quickly as possible, and increasing that into perpetuity. On the economic or on the environmental side of things, perhaps you've heard of ecotourism before. Um, this is kind of predated, and we still use the word ecotourism, but I'd say, as someone working in tourism, often we use the word sustainable tourism more because ecotourism, again, kind of implies that we're talking about the environment. But even it, from once we started talking about ecotourism in the 70s, it was always about this kind of broader, well, here's the definition here: designed to promote sustainability by minimizing long-term damage to nature or local cultures. Often is driven by kind of nature tourism, trying to get out into the environment, right? We have lots of what we would label as ecotourist kind of experiences up here in the Keweenaw. But there's also, again, this focus on making sure that you're traveling to some sort of perhaps environmental preserve or some kind of conservation district doesn't impact local communities. And even the preservation of nature isn't at the detriment of uh, the community itself either. Thinking about how do you balance these things out? Because you can go and kick a bunch of people off the land and designate a national park in a space. And then now you have this nice kind of forest for people to go and tour. But what about the communities who lived there before? And we can think about that as either indigenous communities or settler communities. And we've seen the National Park Service in its kind of lifetime make very questionable choices across many different community kind of impacts, whether it's out west with indigenous peoples or it was mentioned I did my graduate degrees in at Kent State in Ohio and Cuyahoga Valley National Park. Um, Basically displaced entire towns in order to establish this national park. So there would be this feeling of kind of remote natural wilderness between Akron and Cleveland when it's really in a metro. And they had to remove a lot of people, about 700 people, in order to establish that national park. And so those legacies continue.
Mm.
And of course, thinking about if the environmental impacts of tourism, we can't forget to mention the broader impacts that tourism have on our planet. Um, Transportation in the United States, and this is from 2022, is still our largest contributor of greenhouse gases. Now, a lot of that is from freight, a lot of that is from the airline industry, which doesn't always mean someone's traveling for tourism, but a substantial portion of that transportation can be attributed towards tourism, whether that is personal vehicles or airlines or the broader kind of tourism industries in servicing those. Um, that tourism industry. And I promised Joan that I had a slide on Bhutan. Again, we were talking about this before the talk from the film series was brought up. Uh, Bhutan has an interesting case of focusing on national happiness and integrating that national happiness into their tourism model. And they really take this kind of slow tourism and degrowth tourism approaches into their policies, thinking about high value and low volume. So they were facing, and I'll talk about this in a minute here, they were facing a concept called over tourism, where your carrying capacity simply could not meet the number of people traveling to a place. And those kind of the increase in people were having a negative impact on the economy when maybe your labor market can't keep up with that. Maybe your infrastructure can't keep up with that. Maybe it was impacting your culture. If your language or your even cultural practices are either ignored or exploited by a tourism industry, that can cause harm to a community. And so, for all of these reasons, Bhutan decided to take their kind of focus on national happiness, which is a whole other thing that we were kind of talking about before the talk started, but took that focus on national happiness and took a degrowth model. They decided to limit tourist visas to a certain number, basically a cap per year. They instituted nightly tariffs on any non-group travel. So if you want to travel to Bhutan on your own, you're paying a $250 per night tax on top of whatever hotel fees you're paying. And that way, it's mostly concentrating people into group travel so that not, everyone's not renting a car and kind of driving up through the mountains. It also limits movement. So closing through the visa process, closing borders and basically requiring tourist visas. They nationalize their air travel so that they can have more control over who is flying or how the country is benefiting from the air travel, and requiring so with that group travel, requiring tour guide, and they have a series of kind of policies of who is allowed to be a tour guide, and what are they supposed to be doing when they're doing this. So again, it's shifting from this kind of high value to low impact model. And Bhutan is a very small country, in between India and China in the Himalayas, and so it's not a model that other countries could use, kind of countrywide, but it's perhaps a model that communities could use, or at least take borrow some aspects from, um, as we're thinking about. And tourist visas, particularly, is a pattern that we're seeing globally. If anyone traveled to the EU this year, this was the first year that the EU instituted tourist visas, and it's like €8 or €9. It's not much, kind of per person that you pay, but it is recognizing there are so many tourists traveling to certain places. We can use visas perhaps to limit some of that travel, but more so by getting money from the tourist visas, they can then use that money to mitigate the impacts that the tourists are having on infrastructure and other kind of services. Um, and then finally, on the kind of environmental side, in tourism studies, we have a concept called the tourism paradox. And it is basically the idea that tourists, particularly environmental, kind of nature-seeking tourists, um, in seeking the wilderness or in seeking this kind of natural landscape, whatever it might be, inevitably the more people are driven to see this beautiful kind of untouched nature that a lot of people are kind of trying to find, the more that they destroy that beautiful untouched nature. The more popular a site becomes, the more tourists potentially, well, or the more tourists change that site and potentially destroy that site. And so I have a picture of Antarctic tourists down here on the bottom left. And every single Antarctic tourists contribute significant greenhouse gases that we can map exactly onto how much glacier is being melted because or of ice caps that are being melted because of each and every single one of these people who are going to travel to see these ice caps and these glaciers. And so this is the tourism paradox, and thinking about, okay, how do we avoid it if we can, is one of the kind of big questions that is unresolved in tourism studies, but is always kind of at the front of our minds as we're working through these questions. I'm lumping political and cultural sustainability together. As I said, most people do this anyway, and I don't have all the time in the world to go through it. But one thing I want to focus on the political side of things are the role of. I'm actually going to back up so we don't you don't get distracted by reading all the words. Um, One of the aspects of political kind of sustainability we see happen this week, right? With an election, we have a change in government. It's going to have significant impacts on the policies that are going to impact how tourism operates around the country. We actually see this around the world. Um, if you've seen some of the articles thinking about how the election this year fits in with kind of the global patterns in elections, just about every single democratic institution around the world that had elections this year have replaced the standing political party with a different political party because there's kind of this general dissatisfaction. Imagine all of these countries who have been going in one direction within some kind of political mindset of what is right to be doing as far as planning, as far as how you're, all the aspects that are impacted through political decisions from a government level, all of those shifts, it's very hard to plan if your political system is constantly shifting. Um, and so that's where our international institutions come in. And so we have multiple multi-state institutions like the United Nations that are able to be this kind of more stable political unit. As our countries are always shifting and these different policies may be changing, we have some of these kind of steadfast political institutions around the world that we can look to, whose goals can kind of maintain tourism sustainability over time, while our individual countries may be kind of flip-flopping a little bit. And again, making it hard to plan. And one of those things, one of those institutions, is what used to be UNWTO, the World Tourism Organization. I still say UNWTO because they just changed their name in February to UN Tourism. But this is the United Nations agency responsible for the promotion of responsible, sustainable, and universally accessible tourism. There's 159 member states. I think it's actually 160. I don't know if I've changed that. And it doesn't include quite a few kind of major players in tourism. Australia, um, Canada, New Zealand, United Kingdom, the United States, and others. But it does include the European Union, and all EU member states are kind of thus included. So a lot of the EU members don't join directly. Um, with 10 to 15 million euros as a budget, their primary goal is sustainable tourism and thinking about sustainable tourism around the world. And so they have things like World Tourism Day to promote uh, uh, basically promote the idea of sustainable tourism. But then they were able to give out kind of grants and initiatives to individual kind of organizations and countries around the world to be able to explore kind of how they might be able to do sustainable tourism better. The United States left in 1998, I want to say. Basically, the State Department was the one that was the member state and their budget got cut and they simply didn't have money to keep paying. And we haven't joined since. So there's not kind of a big, yeah, there's not a huge kind of controversy in there other than we just didn't have the money to keep paying. Well, we didn't make the money to keep paying. We certainly have the money to keep paying. Um, the other big one of there's three of these organizations I want to talk about. The other one goes all the way back to the United Nations itself, right? And the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which you're probably familiar with. These are a 2030 agenda with 17 parts sent up by the United Nations General Assembly, um, with basically this overarching goal for sustainable development. Michigan Tech is an observer, and we've sent faculty and students to the annual conference every year since 2020. Um, we've actually been kind of growing our presence in that space. Um, this past year, 2023, no, it was 2024, we had a whole week of kind of lectures and guest speakers and things in the pavilion itself rather than kind of being an outside kind of observer just hopping in and out. But so there's these 17 goals, and three of them directly address tourism. Ooh, can't quite see that. Sorry, some formatting issues there. I think you can get the gist of the text. So the first one is this kind of part of decent work and economic growth, the eighth goal. But each one of these goals has different initiatives within it. And so 8.9 is to devise and implement policies to promote sustainable tourism that create jobs and promote local culture and products. Um, to think about how tourism could be a proportion of your GDP, and if you're trying to grow your economy in that growth rate. Thinking about how to, if you're not currently doing tourism, how you could sustainably integrate tourism into your economy. The second would be goal 12, responsible consumption and production, which really kind of connects back into what we've already been talking about. Um, Basically, being able to monitor sustainable development impacts for sustainable tourism, right? To how can we ensure that the tourism that we're doing is helping and not harming a community. And so this goal is actually kind of more scientific in nature and thinking about, well, what are the mechanisms to be able to monitor um, some of this tourism development? That's the goal here. And then life underwater is kind of an obscure one, but it mentions tourism, and it's particularly with island developing states and thinking about how to balance tourism within kind of a pluralized, a diverse economy for developing island states, where tourism can very quickly become a large and even the dominant economic activity within a country. And so how can the United Nations and these countries kind of work together to think about how could you diversify your economy and make sure you're doing all kind of the best practices around tourism as well? Because it's important to kind of point out, and I didn't mention this before, but tourism, more so than any other economic industry, is incredibly fickle. If you think about, for most people, at least in the United States, once you hit kind of economic hardship, if you're trying to tighten your wallet, what's probably the very first thing that gets cut from your budget? It's your vacation, or at least it's a downsizing of your vacation, right? You're not going to cut education or your health care or food or shelter, right? Tourism is the most impacted economic industry. And that's not even mentioning COVID-19. So it's very hard to rely upon tourism as a predominant force within your economy. So how can you plan to benefit from it without relying upon it? Because there will be another, just like I was talking about before, there will be another economic recession at some point. It's inevitable. We have these kind of growths and falls within the economic structures that we have. So how can you plan for that next time that we have a recession and no one is traveling? or the next time that we have a pandemic and no one is traveling. Is your economy able to be plan for that economic reality of not having tourists? Kind of deviated back in the economic section there. But the last organization that I want to talk about is UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And there's multiple parts that intersect with tourism. The science aspect, the geoparks and the biospheres and sports all are connected to tourism. And we've actually the Keweenaw has had a bid to be a global geopark for many years now. That has not been adopted. But I want to focus a bit more on the heritage side of things. It's my own kind of focus. And there's lots of aspects to the heritage branch of UNESCO, but the two most prominent ones are World Heritage Sites, which you've probably heard of before, and intangible cultural heritage sites, which you may have heard of before. And you can see there's about twice as many, 1,223 World Heritage Sites around the world, and only 730 intangible cultural heritage. The difference here is World Heritage Sites are kind of rooted in landscape, whereas intangible cultural heritage is rooted in cultural practice. So it can include kind of food, dance, language, sports, whereas a World Heritage Site is a place on the landscape that's very kind of specifically designated. Um, and we can see these kind of stretched around the world. Again, thinking about the United States' role here, we are not a signature of the intangible cultural heritage. There's actually quite a few countries around the world, basically the same ones who aren't members of the UNWTO, UK, Australia, South Africa, Russia, United States, Canada. Um, but we are signature on the World Heritage Site designation, and we do have 20, I want to say 24 World Heritage Sites, significantly fewer than other countries, particularly given our population and our size. Um, but thinking about World Heritage as this kind of way of designating outstanding universal cultural value or natural. There are natural World Heritage sites as well, the green dots on this map. Most of them are culturally based, though. So how can we think about outstanding universal value and use, so the World Heritage and UNESCO broadly is a way of designating these places and thinking about the cultural sustainability of World Heritage. It's kind of a double-edged sword with both intangible and the World Heritage sites. On one hand, it could be a means of exploiting or even commercializing something that's a kind of a traditional craft or traditional practice, that now you're saying, okay, this is the global thing. What happens when millions of people try to come and experience this thing that maybe it's lace making, right? Something very specific, very time consuming, typically very small scale. If it's a kind of an intangible cultural heritage designation, it's not going to be a lace factory. It's going to be kind of a folk practice, kind of a cottage industry. But now you have millions of people coming to experience this lace making. Do you change how you make lace, where you make lace, who is making lace in order to uh, appease those millions of people coming in, or even to attract more? Because now you see, oh, we could base our economy upon this lace making, um, in a way that we could, of course, sell that lace before, but now what if we changed it to be able to sell more? And now has that changed the intangible aspect? On the other hand, these things can also be part of a cultural sustainability model. And that's where my kind of argument for World Heritage Sites, particularly in post-extractive industries, come in. Many cases, these World Heritage Sites around kind of post-mining landscapes are a way for the community to basically tell the next generation, again, thinking about sustainability, cultural sustainability within a community, to tell the next generation that the ruins that are around us, and the Copper Country is a great example of this, the ruins around us are not simply kind of symbols of economic failure or just are nothing with no cultural value, but they have a lot to tell us about the story of this place, the people who came here, the work that they did, the labor that they put into this industry, the risks that they took, the hardships that they faced. There are a lot of stories that can be told once you put this World Heritage label on a landscape. And so that's one thing I've been finding in Wales, right? This old kind of slate quarries that many of the youth in that area think is just, waste, right? It's just a ruined landscape. And environmentally speaking, it is in a lot of ways. Um, but there are also lots of stories behind that landscape that once you have, oh, well, other people around the world have said this has outstanding universal value. Maybe my grandparents aren't just kind of making things up. Maybe this does have value, and maybe there are kind of stories that can be told. And now the organizations who have been trying to tell those stories might be able to get more grants, might be able to get more, well, funding from tourists who come in to be able to tell those stories in a more robust, uh, visible way. I am looking at time here. I'm going to try to keep going a little bit faster. Uh, Generally, I'm asking whose culture is being represented? What is the role of power, the economy, and practice, and how these cultural practices or cultural landscapes are being preserved, conserved, or exploited. And it comes down again to this intersection of kind of political power, economic decisions, cultural practices, and the environmental impacts from those decisions. Um, I'm going to jump forward so that we have time to talk more about the Keweenaw. Basically, I have a bunch of other questions, and these are just questions that I ask. Um, Thinking about cultural appropriation is, of course, an important consideration to take in place. And I think I've kind of mentioned that already. Um, my own role within sustainable tourism, again, I been at Michigan Tech for 6 years now. When I got here, my initial kind of question was what is already being taught around tourism on campus? And other than an outdoor recreation course taught in forestry, there are no tourism courses taught at Michigan Tech. And so I proposed kind of two tourism courses, like I said at the beginning of this talk. But I also really value, and this is the geographer in me, really value getting students out of the classroom and into the world, particularly kind of away from here to really see how other people experience and work through some of the same problems that we've been talking about. Um, and so my idea was, okay, I want to take students out of the campus to think about sustainable tourism. I want to take them on some kind of study away, right? Study abroad. The problem you hit is, okay, I'm going to study abroad. As soon as you hop on that airplane, you're having such an environmental impact that it's hard to really make that argument around a true sustainable tourism. And so my idea was, okay, what if I were to just take every single best practice I could possibly think of and devise a program around that? And that is my Amtrak program, where I take students out west on Amtrak. We only use public transit. We only stay in independent hotels. We only eat at independently, locally owned farm to table restaurants. We work with the communities that we're meeting. Um, we try to spend multiple days in a location that we're at. We're typically staying in the city or the town centers. Um, and I have a couple kind of examples of, I don't have time to get into the work that I've actually done in these spaces. But I do have a couple kind of articles that I've written about this. If you want the academic one, I have an article in the Journal of Geography and Higher Ed. Happy to send that. I've got a kind of a public link that I can send uh, that out, or publish this kind of overarching kind of concept of what I do in the course in the conversation. And that should be easy enough to Google, but I could also easily send a link out to that. Um, like I said, though, most of my work is in Wales. And I have a couple of, if you're interested in kind of my work on tourism studies in Wales, a lot of that so far has been work around the coal industry, and particularly at the National Coal Museum called Big Pit, in South Wales. I've got a podcast about kind of the most recent paper I've written about that. There's also this kind of blog post, A Future of Black as Coal, about a couple work I did a couple of years ago. Both of them are with a good friend of mine, William Price, who's at Ball State, a tourism geographer, much more tourism geographer than I am. Um, and I have been taking students. Um, I, Last year was the first official program, called Community Transformations, where we look at the role of heritage in kind of healing the economic and environmental sort of scars that these heavy industries have had in the country, and how tourism, among many other things, um, have been used sustainably or unsustainably, throughout the country. And I do have a 2025 program. It's currently accepting applicants. We do take community members. We take students from outside of tech. We take undergrads, uh, graduate students. So if you or anyone you know is interested, I'm happy to talk more about that as well. Um, but I do want to spend, the last 5 minutes or so talking about sustainable tourism in the Keweenaw, which is probably why most of you are here, and you're wondering why I have taken so long to actually talk about that. The first thing I want to talk about is the Keweenaw Sustainable Tourism Series. And the irony is my students are the ones running this semester. Um, there are 4 talks this semester. 2 have already happened. These next 2 are coming up this week: land use planning for tourism, and early next month, global heritage tourism and the intersections in the Keweenaw. So these are my, second year intro to sustainable tourism students. So they're very general overview, but I'd say more specific than what I'm giving right now. And I've been incredibly impressed with the work that they've done already. But just kind of flagging the page on Visit Keweenaw, visitkeweenaw.com, for this KSTS, this Sustainable Tourism Series. These are always public. These are always conducted by people in the Keweenaw, about the Keweenaw, and about sustainable tourism in the Keweenaw. And this program's been running for about 18 months now. Dr. Brad Barnett at Visit Keweenaw is kind of the person who's running all of that up. So this is a great kind of conversation that's been going on. And that's one of the most important aspects that I haven't really talked about with sustainable tourism, is the role of education and making sure that people are educated about how to be sustainable tourists. And that's what Love the Keweenaw is. Another Visit Keweenaw initiative, also Dr. Brad Barnett. Um, this is more or less an education outreach to recreational users on protected lands in the Keweenaw landscape, with the community, trying to focus on this kind of positive action, educating people about how to sustainably use trails, how to sustainably plan for the Keweenaw and all the kind of issues you may run into up here, whether it's cell service or gas, or making sure your maps are working, or wildlife, or trail use, any of those types of things. Thinking about collective practice, trying to get the sense that we share these trails, we share these waters, we share these forests. So how can we make sure the decisions we make as communities and as individuals can continue sharing these resources, these tourism resources, for everyone, the community and the tourists. Um, and again, kind of mitigating over tourism. And I just saw this the other day. I don't know if anyone else did, but the Bridge posted this article about Marquette, and the Travel Marquette website, which is the equivalent to our Visit Keweenaw, actually just removed Presque Isle and Dead River Falls from their website because there's simply too many people. trying to visit these sites right now. They don't have the capacity. On the roads, they don't have the capacity just on the space with the number of people who have been going to them. This kind of idea of loved to death was a quote that I think someone from the city council used. Um, and again, that is where Love the Keweenaw is trying to step in, plan ahead for what is inevitably coming our way. And I say that thinking about the amount of tourism that we've seen. These are tourism dollars spent in Houghton County. Um, Look at that number from 2020 to 2023. We went from about 60 million to almost $100 million coming in. If this line continues over the next 5 years, we're going to be in the same place that Marquette is in now. And in some places we're almost there because our infrastructure is not designed in the same way that even Marquette's is. Right? We have a single bridge that gets in. We have two flights a day that come in. Um, there are certain choke points that are going to limit the amount of tourists that we can handle, and how we plan for those tourists. And we're going to get those tourists. This is a map from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, thinking about in 2060, the number of weeks per year that will be above 95 degrees. Um, the country is heating up, particularly the the South, but also I didn't share this other map, kind of the Illinois, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, where humidity is going to intersect with that increased heat, is going to be increasingly unhealthy for some individuals and uncomfortable for many individuals. Whereas you see where we are in the Keweenaw, we are going to be this climate refuge. And another map from the same research article shows that, right? Unlike much of the rest of the country that is dealing with economic loss from climate change, Keweenaw County is one of 5 counties in the country that they're predicting having the largest amount of economic gain from tourism. Not from tourism, but this is just in general from in their GDP. But I think we can make that connection back to tourism there. And Houghton County and Ontonagon also kind of part of that. Again, we will be this climate refuge. And if we're not planning for that, we will very quickly land in the same place as Marquette or Traverse City, others. So what are we currently doing? We have a transit system. Marquette is thinking about how do they create a shuttle system, perhaps to get out to some of these more desirable spots. We actually had someone coming up from Indiana just this week on working with the county and working with the city of Hancock to kind of assess the transit system that we currently have here. I met with him on Monday, and he was actually very impressed with our on-demand shuttle, which he used to get around. And this is Monday to Friday, 7 to 5. How can we, utilize that, but also think about what fixed routes do we have, and is it what we need? And again, I'm not saying as a geographer, I always want more public transit. But again, does our policy and how can we plan thinking about where we're heading? What are we doing? And is what we're doing enough to accommodate for what we see in the research? And again, if you think about that first chart, this is all based upon research that tells us, okay, this is how many people may be coming, this is where they may be going, and this is what we might need to do in order to accommodate them. Um, I love the idea of human power sports if we're thinking about kind of environmental impact. And I don't think any other place better in the country for human power sports than the Keweenaw, whether it's kayaking, canoeing, biking, hiking, walking, swimming, um, skiing, right? All of these kind of human-powered, non-motorized recreational vehicles um, allow us to have minimal economic impact, or minimal environmental impact, while also kind of, again, more or less forcing that kind of locally rooted aspects of things. And you could see my dogs in there too, and my wife. Um, uh, and then finally, thinking about the inclusive tourism landscapes that we may or may not have in the Keweenaw. How many of our buildings or our cities are ADA compliant with ramps, doors, elevators? If we're going to be seeing increased tourism, do we need to change to accommodate these spaces? Again, I'm not saying yes or no, but these are considerations that have to be made. Um, tribal sovereignty and treaty rights are people who are coming up here recognizing and aware of treaty rights that our lands and our waters have through KBIC and the Ojibwa. Um, thinking about just as more people come up, thinking about the religious or gender or linguistic diversity, are, do we have places for prayer spaces? Do we have food that people would be expecting? Do we have language? If we have tours at Quincy Mine, for example, are there multiple languages available if we're thinking about multiple languages? And are people respecting Ojibwa language or Finnish language that is still practiced in the area in a limited amounts anyway? Um, all of these are considerations that should be kept, and also thinking about this kind of general idea that we have the freedom of movement. Article 4 of the Constitution and Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights both guarantee freedom of movement within a country, basically. And so, as long as we still have that freedom of movement, and we have this very desirable place, we're going to continue to see increased people coming here. So how do we plan around that increase in tourism that we will inevitably see, but also make sure that our economy doesn't rely fully upon tourists, because that's not healthy either. So I think Oh, again, just remind you, this Thursday, 2 to 3, land use planning for tourism. This is the building that's across from the Mineral Museum up on campus, the
Mm.
Advanced Technology Development Complex. And that is all I have. Thank you so much.
Well,